Revealed, an amazing rancher hides an Apache mother and son. Now she asks him to be a father again. Jim Callahan's heart drummed against his ribs as he stepped quietly into the dim barn, ready for his nightly routine. He felt the ever-present weight of the world on his shoulders, his family's ranch, a tradition of grit and integrity crumbling under the harsh Texas sun. Economic pressures loomed large, the land that once thrived now choked by drought and shifting agricultural practices. Each day felt like a bitter struggle against a tide that threatened to swallow everything he held dear. The gripping reality, his hope was waning, not just for the ranch, but for himself. And then everything changed. Behind the hay bales, he could see movement. At first, he thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on him, but soon clarity pierced the darkness. An Apache woman, her son clutched tightly to her side, their eyes wide with fear. Jim's chest constricted. This was not a world that welcomed outsiders. With one hesitant step forward, uncertainty flooded his mind. Should he report them? Alert the authorities? But as their desperate expressions met his, something deep within ignited, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. He crouched down, allowing their stories to unfold. Sarah spoke softly of her journey, her voice laced with quiet resolve. As Eli laughed and chased after fireflies, Jim felt a pang of longing twist in his gut, reminiscent of memories he had buried. He lost his son too soon. Life had stripped him of that bond, leaving him hollow. But now, the laughter filled the void, momentarily pushing the suffocating pressures to the back of his mind. The walls seemed to close in tighter around him, though. What he felt was budding connection, yet with it arose the painful specter of his responsibilities, not just to his ranch, but to a community whose eyes were always watching. What did it mean to defend this family? He replayed the words of old friends echoing disdain, warning against outsiders who tainted their way of life. The tension coiled in his gut as he weighed his options. Each argument against them seemed like chains binding him to inaction. Should he follow the crowd or listen to the instinct stirring within him? Just as their bond began to deepen, Sarah revealed the truth that uprooted him completely. Eli's father, his childhood friend, was locked away, a victim of prejudice that coursed through their town like wildfire. Jim felt the floor beneath him shift as the weight of complicity bore down. Could he ignore the pain of a friend warped by injustice? Yet any thought of extending kindness to Sarah and her son carried with it the stench of danger. Conversations turned. The rancher's whispers, toxic and sharp, sank into the soil around him, growing more hostile each day. Jim faced their ire should they discover his secret. The very legacy he fought for could unravel at any moment. The contrast between his growing affection for this small family and his own crumbling future thrummed in his veins, cascading into a deep sense of dread. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system, and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. The moment weighed heavier now. He was torn between standing up for what was right and the very real threat of losing everything he'd built. What would his neighbors think? He could already envision the accusations, see the ire on their faces, feel their judgment hot on his back. Then just as the turmoil reached a peak, an unexpected visitor appeared, news in hand that threatened to shake his very foundation once more. Jim stood frozen, heart racing, knowing the decision laid before him now had to be made swiftly. He grasped for air, gazing into uncertainty. Should he dare chart a path that held his past and future in delicate balance? The visitor's silhouette emerged clearly against the barn's weak light, the shadow suddenly invoking a cascade of thoughts. Jim's mind raced, processing the familiar form of Tom, a nearby rancher and one of the more vocal opponents of any perceived threat to their way of life. The tension in Jim's shoulders twisted tighter, a blend of anger and fear coiling within. He could almost sense the judgment crackling in the air between them. "Jim, we need to talk." Tom's voice was low but strong, cutting through the stagnant air. The words hung there, heavy with unspoken implications. Despite the closeness of their past, this was no friendly visit. He could feel his heart pounding as he instinctively gauged the distance to the exit. Should he sneak past or engage? "I'm busy," Jim replied, playing for time. The laughter of Eli faintly echoed behind him, a stark contrast to the tension that dripped from Tom's presence. The innocence of the boy tugged at his heartstrings. Making a decision felt urgent, yet he knew playing nice could lead to detrimental consequences. Busy with what? Hiding those people? The accusation was swift, laced with venom. Jim's stomach churned, thoughts clashing. What were the boundaries of loyalty? To what extent was integrity worth risking? He was determined to protect Sarah and Eli, feeling an inexplicable bond forming with them, yet the collective fury of the ranchers rallied against him like a storm ready to break. "What they did to Eli's father was wrong, Tom," Jim said, his voice steadying itself, breaking the narrative of intimidation wrestling within him. "You can't call yourself a friend and ignore the truth." He said it firmly, yet internally, he feared the repercussions for both his family and Sarah's. "Friend, you're risking your future for a woman and child who have nothing to do with this land or its people. Think about what you're doing." Tom's voice dripped with falsely wrapped caution, layer upon layer of hostility bubbling beneath. Yet Jim questioned himself. Was it truly only his future he was risking? As the confrontation unfolded, Jim felt a surge of clarity ignite within him. With each passing second, he confronted the truth within. Losing the ranch might be the end or the beginning of something more significant. The struggles of the past haunted him, yet accepting these new relationships could wield unexpected strength. A life lived in silence and regret couldn't possibly bear any weight against the warmth of Sarah's smile or the innocent laughter of Eli. "This is not just about my ranch anymore, Tom," Jim said, his tone rising above the static. "It's about what's right." He could feel the tide of conviction swelling inside him, each word carrying away layers of fear, revealing a flicker of fierce determination. Tom scoffed, brow furrowed in disbelief. "You'll regret this, Callahan. You think they'll protect you? You're more vulnerable than ever." The threat in Tom's voice hung like a storm cloud, darkening the threshold of the barn. Ignoring the ultimatum, Jim shifted his focus, gathering his resolve. Tom's presence began to fade as the laughter of Eli resonated clearer, sparking a mission inside of him that he hadn't acknowledged. He must protect them, take a stand. Someone needed to confront the prejudice bubbling beneath their shared lives. "Then let's see the kind of man I am, Tom. I'll fight for them." His declaration blasted through the atmosphere around him, replacing hesitation with purpose. As Tom's silhouette retreated, the barn filled with a stillness that felt electric. A moment suspended in time where everything shifted, and he stood on the precipice of a decision that could reshuffle the deck of his convictions. Jim's newly ignited sense of purpose marched forward, igniting a fire in his belly as he realized the rising storm wouldn't change his next steps. Boundaries had been drawn with Tom that would prove difficult to navigate, yet with Sarah and Eli came a chance to redefine what family meant. His newfound clarity dawned upon him, but it came with a haunting sense of urgency. As he stepped back into the dim light, the shadows swirled around him, pressing closer as if to smother the flicker of hope. Yet at that moment, he realized he had two paths ahead: retreat or fight. The line between friend and enemy had blurred grotesquely, leaving him questioning who in this town truly represented his beliefs. But he also faced another crucial choice. Jim understood now that standing up for what was right could come at a price. The skies outside darkened, and the whispers of ranchers began to haunt him more than ever. With the precipice of conflict inching closer, he felt the throbbing beat of his heart synchronize with a question that loomed across the horizon. How far would he go to protect a boy he barely knew and a mother he barely trusted? As the barn door creaked with the weight of Tom's departure, Jim felt the stillness settle, heavy and suffocating. The fear that had coiled tightly in his gut momentarily released, replaced by a sharper awareness of the choices that lay ahead. Each decision now felt weighted with profound consequences, drawing to surface an internal struggle he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. His instincts urged him to dismiss the confrontation, to retreat back into the shadows of safety and isolation. But the laughter of Eli intertwined with the echoes of Tom's threats, reverberating in his mind like a clarion call. What did it mean to truly protect someone? Wasn't it more than just providing shelter? Gripping the weathered wood of a barn beam, he sought out the warmth of purpose buried beneath layers of apprehension. With every breath, he could sense the urgency of his situation. Sarah and Eli had entered his life unexpectedly, upending the routine he had held onto since he became a man. They represented possibilities he hadn't dared to see in himself, a chance to redefine his narrative. Yet what if Tom's warning held truth? What if his efforts to shield them drew the ire of the very community he had relied upon for survival, unraveling the thick threads of loyalty he'd woven throughout his life? Pushing past the doubts, Jim took a step into the deeper recess of the barn, where the scattered tools and forgotten memories lay like silent witnesses to his contemplation. In the dim light, they transformed into reflections of all he had lost and all he might gain if he embraced this new path. A spark of determination flared as he imagined the boy's laughter rippling through a safer world. He could feel the weight of the ranch pressing down on him, years of tradition and the expectations of others pulsing at the back of his mind, but something else challenged it, the call to altruism, an echo of integrity that resonated in his heart. There was no way he could turn his back on Sarah and Eli now. They represented an awakening, a catalyst pushing him beyond the constraints of his former self. With a surge of newfound purpose, Jim shifted his focus to action. He needed to confront his fears head-on. Could he reach out to the other ranchers, perhaps even sway a few allies to stand by him? Or was isolation the only thing left for a man who dared to go against the tide? If he could gather support, it would reinforce not just his decisions but his transformation. And yet, that itself felt risky, challenging ideals held by those he had known his entire life. In an insular world where loyalty could quickly become suspicion, he was walking a razor's edge. The wind howled softly outside, whispering reminders of the brewing storm. The ranchers were not just angry, they'd been fueled by fear. Fear of change, fear of the unknown. What if Jim could channel some of that fear into understanding? What if he could reshape the town's narrative? Steeling himself, he resolved to visit some of the more open-minded families first, strategizing a way to slowly shift the tide of sentiment. Each visit would require deftness, patience, and the strength to confront not just their fears, but his own ingrained beliefs as well. But the question loomed larger than any strategy. Was he brave enough to redefine what it meant to be a father, not just to Eli, but to maintain strong connections that could lead to protection for Sarah and her son? As he prepared for the evening's gathering of ranchers who would discuss their recent grievances, he felt the thrumming beat of his heart synchronizing with the lesson he was learning, one about vulnerability, responsibility, and the tangled threads of community. Though facing them would ignite tensions he could hardly predict, the seeds of change were planted in his mind. It became impossible to ignore what kind of man he yearned to be. With resolve building, the specter of his previous life dimmed, making space for this new identity to flourish. He took a deep breath, stepping toward the exit, ready to face the darkening world outside. The time had come to face those who had long shaped his destiny, and to challenge what everyone believed about right and wrong, community and family. In that moment of resolve, Jim knew he was neither retreating nor merely preparing for confrontation. He was crafting a new life. But would they accept the change he so desperately needed? Or would they deem him a pariah, forcing him to make a stand come what may? As he stepped out of the barn and into the crisp night air, Jim felt the swell of humidity against his skin, a stark contrast to the cold dread curling within him. Each footstep on the beaten path away from the barn felt like a defiance of fate, an assertion that he would not simply be swept along by the currents of his community's expectations. The flickering lights from the ranchers' homes dotted the landscape like stars fallen to earth. He had been welcomed into their lives, yet now he had to confront the very foundations of those relationships. Jim focused on the first house, its welcoming glow beckoning him closer. This family, the Morales, had always been more open-minded. They had a son around Eli's age, and their laughter often drifted across the yard during neighborly gatherings. Joyful memories that now felt like ghosts haunting him, reminders of the man he once was. He raised a hand and knocked. The sound echoed, hollow and small against the wooden door. It took a moment, but the door creaked open, revealing the warm face of Maria Morales. Her smile faltered slightly as she registered Jim's tense demeanor, the unmistakable weight of urgency shadowing his presence. "Jim, is everything all right?" she asked, concern lacing her words. He hesitated, the social niceties twisting within him like a heavy knot. "Can we talk?" he managed, stepping over the threshold into the comforting chaos of family life. Seated around the dining table, their home felt alive with warmth and laughter, yet it amplified the stark reality of his situation. As Maria bustled about, her husband, Miguel, caught Jim's eye. The man had always respected him, but now Jim felt like an uninvited guest ready to unpack burdens far too heavy for such a joyful space. "Jim, what's going on?" Miguel asked, eyeing him warily but with genuine concern. Taking a breath, Jim began to outline the growing tensions within the community, the threats from Tom, and the weight of his desire to protect Sarah and Eli. As he spoke, the words began to tumble out, each one straining against the hesitations rooted deep in his past. He grappled with the fear of being judged, but he pressed on, driven by a desperate need for understanding. As layers of tension unfurled in the dim light, he watched as Maria's expression shifted from confusion to empathy. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, grounding him. "You're standing up for what is right, but you do know that not everyone will agree, right? Some will—" Her voice trailed off, but the meaning hung pungently in the air. A door opened in Jim's mind, revealing truths he had long buried. "I'm tired of living in fear of what others think," he said, a sudden force slicing through his words. "If I want to protect Eli and Sarah, I have to redefine what it means to be a father, to build a community where they are accepted." Miguel leaned back, a slow nod of approval brightening his face. "That takes courage, my friend, but you can't do it alone." With a flicker of determination igniting the edges of his resolve, Jim realized the path ahead would demand more than just bravery. It would require formal alliances and honest conversations, strength that rooted in vulnerability. It demanded that he inspire change within others. The walls he built around himself were peeling away, revealing potential he had withheld from his own consciousness. As he left the Morales home, Jim felt a spark flicker in his chest. Perhaps he could reach others, sway them with his conviction and earnestness. He thought of the ranchers who might still listen, who might rally behind an idea rather than resist it. What if he could gather their fears, confront the shadows of suspicion with light, foster understanding and empathy in a place where fear had taken the reins? Yet as he stepped into the chill of the night, the uncertainty loomed. It wasn't just about rallying support, it was about crafting a new legacy, one that might set a precedent for generations. Would they accept his call to adapt? Or would they take up arms against the change he envisioned? In that moment, standing under the vast expanse of stars, Jim understood that his next move could either ignite hope or drown him in tumult. The time had come to form alliances, but at what cost? The next morning broke with a muted light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the land like the remnants of his anxieties. Jim stood on his porch, the morning air fresh with the scent of dew and potential. Despite the sun rising, uncertainty knotted his stomach, reminding him of the challenges ahead. He turned to Eli, who was peering curiously out the window. The boy's innocence tugged at something deep within Jim, a longing to shield him from the complexities of this world while equipping him to navigate it boldly. Jim knelt down, meeting his son's gaze directly. "Today, I need your help." Eli's eyes widened, a look of excitement mingling with confusion. "What kind of help?" "Today, I want you to be brave with me. We're going to see some of the ranchers. I need to talk to them about how we can help Mom," Jim explained, feeling the weight of that unfamiliar word. "Help," push against his lips. "But what if they don't like what you have to say?" Eli asked, his brow furrowed with apprehension. Jim hesitated, the nagging fear creeping back in. "Then we keep talking. It's important they hear this from us." His tone was firm, but uncertainty flickered within. Was he a man willing to pave the way for change while risking everything? Setting out towards the nearest ranch, Jim forced his steps to be confident, each footfall a testament to his commitment. They passed a few familiar fields, the rustle of the grass echoing his internal turmoil, but he kept his focus steady. Upon arriving, he found Miguel and several other ranchers gathered, their voices a blend of camaraderie, but hanging in the air remained an undercurrent of tension. As they turned to greet him, Jim drew a breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "Can we talk?" Jim began, his voice breaking slightly, but underlying. His words was a determination that propelled him forward. "It's important." Miguel nodded encouragingly, the others falling silent. There was something empowering about standing there, grounded by the energy of the men before him. He felt the vulnerability in his throat, but swallowed it down, pushing the sentiments that clamored for release to the back of his mind. "Yesterday, I spoke with Maria. We've all heard the whispers, the fears about what's happening. I've decided we can't live in fear anymore. We must stand in support of what is right," he stated, each word meant to build a bridge between his yearning for acceptance and their understanding. Skepticism flickered in some eyes, particularly from Tom, who didn't mask his irritation. "You're saying we should just turn a blind eye? These people could bring trouble." Jim's heart raced, the tension threatening to wrap around him like chains. "No, but your fear shouldn't dictate our actions. Sarah and Eli deserve to grow up knowing love and acceptance, not judgment. I want to create a space for understanding. A chance, not just for them, but for us too." Silence blanketed the group, thick as the muscles in Jim's arms tense with restrained energy. Every hesitant gaze and twitch of a brow was scrutinizing him, testing the viability of his plea. Suddenly, Eli stepped forward, sensing his father's hesitance. The boy's voice rang clear, full of innocence but laced with urgency. "If we don't help them, who will? I want my mom to be happy and my friends to feel safe." A collective intake of breath shifted through the group, and Jim felt a newfound fire ignite in his chest. Maybe it wasn't just about parents or children, it was about the community's future. The reactions around him were mixed, some beginning to nod slowly, while others remained entrenched in their uncertainty. Jim recognized this was not a battle to win in a single conversation. As doubts warred against hopeful resolve, the knowledge of his vulnerability wrestled with his growing courage. What if this was just the beginning of a long, winding road ahead? "But I need your support. I can't do this alone," he implored, reaching into the depths of his vulnerability. Tom crossed his arms, tension visible in the set of his jaw. "What do you want from us, Jim? To blindly support some cause?" "No," Jim responded, the line between frustration and disbelief blurring. "Be willing to listen and to connect. Look beyond the surface. We all have children. We all want to protect them. Isn't that enough?" In that moment, he saw flickers of possibility. Perhaps the cracks in their armor of prejudice could widen. Changes rarely come easy. The question skittered across his mind like a pebble down a mountainside. Could he anchor this vision through the storm? As the gathering began to murmur among themselves, searching for courage in each other's voices, Jim felt a mix of hope and trepidation. His next step could very well shift the foundations of his community's world. But he also sensed the deep divide that still remained, a realization that no comfort lay without conflict, and soon he would have to confront exactly what that conflict might unleash. The battle of acceptance was just beginning, and the stakes were climbing higher. What if the very alliances Jim sought to build also held the potential for his greatest fears to manifest? As the murmurs rose and fell among the gathered ranchers, Jim watched the shifting expressions on their faces. A mixture of confusion, doubt, and beneath it all, a glimmer of curiosity. He felt a swell of anxiety in his throat, for their reaction could tip the balance of his mission. Could he stay anchored amidst such unpredictable tides? "Let's hear what Jim has to say," Miguel finally spoke, breaking the tension and casting a lifebuoy in the churning waters. The ranchers turned their collective sight back to Jim, whose heart thudded as he sensed the collective spotlight settling over him. "Thank you, Miguel," Jim began, glancing briefly at Eli, who looked up at him with wide eyes that held both hope and fear. In this vulnerable moment, Jim felt the remnants of doubt slipping away. He squared his shoulders, drawing on the boy's innocent courage. "We need to be able to talk about what's happening, about the lives involved. It's not just stories anymore. These are real people we are discussing." Tom's scowl deepened. "And more real problems, Jim. All we're doing is opening ourselves up to trouble." Jim inhaled sharply, the frustration bubbling just beneath his calm facade. Trouble doesn't come from acceptance. Trouble comes from fear, and I'm tired of living in fear. Silence answered, but inside, Jim's resolve began to crystallize like ice in winter's grip. What if your children grow up in a world built on walls rather than bridges? He pressed on, his voice rising slightly. They deserve to see kindness, to learn about understanding, not exclusion. We have the chance to teach them. Yet even as he spoke, he could feel the apprehension crackling through the air, palpable and cold like the morning mist. A deep-seated anger simmered just below the surface, fueled by years of conditioning. He could feel it, a shadow growing larger in the silence. "I'll tell you what I want," Tom shot back, his fists clenching. "I want to keep my family safe. That's what I care about." Jim shifted his weight, trying to balance his conviction against the rising tide of tension. "And I want that too." His voice softened, yet held steady, each word a tether between their opposing fears. "We can protect what we love without shutting others out. We can keep our families safe by learning to help others." With each word hanging in the air between them, Jim could sense the possibility of connection, the delicate thread of shared human experience thrumming softly. Yet doubts remained, gnawing at the edges of his vision. A spectator to his own tumultuous thoughts, Jim deliberated on the confrontation unwinding before him. What if, by standing for love, he stood to lose more than he ever anticipated? Eli's innocence weighed heavily on him like a promise he couldn't afford to break. A sudden shout interrupted his reflection, a voice cutting through to assert authority. "You think a good heart will save your loved ones, Jim? You're a fool!" It was another rancher, Carl, with eyes sparked by indignation. "They're just waiting for an invitation to take everything we got." Jim's heart sank. "Carl, it's about change," he urged, feeling the ground beneath shift. "It's about choosing to move forward, not backward. The only path I see taken is one that comes from understanding, real engagement." "But what if engagement costs us everything?" Carl's tone dripped with cynicism. Jim suddenly realized he was standing at a precarious precipice. His next words could either repel or rally them. "Then we make sure that whatever it costs, it's worth it." His voice rang clearer, bolstered by an inner certainty. "We gain more than we lose. Isn't that the goal? But I need your help. Let's forge this path together." At that moment, a silence fell again, heavy yet charged with unspoken potential. Then Eli, sensing the tension, took another courageous step forward. "Stop being afraid. Mom will show us how to be brave, and I want my dad to be too." The innocence in the boy's plea curdled with an urgency that rattled even Jim. Suddenly, a shift in the atmosphere occurred, almost tangible. Jim felt the weight of what was said, what was shared, pulling him deeper into the danger of vulnerability, yet closer to the hope he sought. As he scanned the ranchers' faces, Jim realized this was only the beginning, a point of no return toward a future unknown. Yet uncertainty gnawed at him. Would this moment be the catalyst for change, or the spark that ignited hostility? Outside the walls of the ranch, clouds began to roll in, the sky darkening. Jim took a breath to steady his racing mind. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, he pondered, could he weather this storm, or would it ultimately drown his efforts before they even took root? Jim blinked as the first few raindrops pattered on the ground, a rhythm echoing the turmoil within him. He barely registered the weather, his focus fixated on the ranchers around him, those faces that mirrored his own internal storm. Each gaze held a challenge, a silent verdict resting on the cusp of judgment. Would they break the cycle of tradition and fear? Or would Jim's vulnerability become yet another reason to fuel suspicion? Simultaneously, Eli's small voice pinned him to the present. That child, with all his unguarded resolve, shook something loose within Jim. In a moment that felt both fragile and invincible, he realized that Eli's expectations weighed more heavily than the rancher's accusations. "Look, I can't promise that this will be easy, but I will promise you." He hesitated, summoning all the sincerity he could muster. "I will do everything in my power to ensure our future isn't wrought with hatred and division." The implications of those words banked against the shadows of suspicion. Carl's hostility wasn't just directed at Jim. It was a shield for the fear that plagued those who had spent their lives holding their families together in a world growing increasingly violent. Was his conviction enough to counterbalance that fear? Amid the rain, he caught Tom's glance, their eyes locking in a moment pregnant with tension. What he saw was a man grappling with resentment, standing on the thin line between opposing fears. Jim sensed that beneath that exterior lay a heart burdened yet still willing to listen, to reason perhaps. What if I told you I spent my own childhood in fear? That I learned to be silent to survive? Tom's brow furrowed, a glimmer of uncertainty flickered across his face. Change doesn't ask for agreement, just a willingness to consider, Jim continued, leaning into this small crack in Tom's resolve. I'm not asking you to embrace vulnerable paths blindly. I'm asking you to see them. We might not know what lies ahead, but do we not owe it to our children to try? Another rancher, Linda, shifted uneasily. She had often been the voice of caution, but her skepticism seemed to waver, her hands clenched in thought. In that moment, the raindrops transformed the atmosphere, washing away the thick dread that hung over him. Each droplet was a small declaration, a reminder that change needed to cleanse the dirt of fear and uncertainty. As the rain picked up, it felt as if it were peeling back the layers of defiance that had long cocooned the group. "Can't you see? We are far more powerful together than alone," Jim urged. The murmurs among the ranchers began. He barely registered the words, speculations intertwined with recognition and perhaps even admiration. It was something that had shifted, like the air after the storm. There was still a long way to go, and as his heart raced, he knew he had to keep on pushing forward. Then unexpectedly, he heard Eli again. "Dad, don't stop. Tell them how we can help." That simple plea hit Jim with a jolt. Eli's earnestness called him further into the depths of his courage. What Jim hadn't fully realized until that moment was that he had been worried about his mission, but perhaps it was his role as Eli's father that truly mattered most. The two were intertwined. His son needed him brave. Just then, the clouds thundered ominously, echoing Jim's mounting tension. He knew the ranchers would go home today, saturated not just in rain, but in a need for change that he had initiated. The real challenge remained. Would they have enough faith to embark on that journey with him? "Let's see where this rain washes us," he whispered to himself, clutching the small parchment he'd been keeping hidden in his pocket. A plan he'd drafted to propose a new alliance, both personal and professional, an olive branch across the fractured landscape. With the wind howling in a call to arms, he took a decisive step forward. But just as he began to form new thoughts about their collective future, a flicker of fear returned. The path towards an uncertain alliance lay steeped in risks he had barely begun to weigh. Would the ranchers see value in collaboration, or would their hesitation drown his aspirations, washing away not just their hope, but his connection to Eli as well? Jim looked around. The storm had only just begun. The rain quickened, creating a chaotic symphony against the hard earth, but Jim felt an unusual warmth spreading within. Like the steely chord of thunder rumbling overhead, the conviction that had started as a whisper was now growing louder. The moment he had long anticipated was at hand, the push against the old resistances that bound these ranchers to their fears. He spotted Tom again, the man's brow now creased with apprehension and curiosity. This flicker of curiosity ignited a spark in Jim. Perhaps there was a path forward if he could only illuminate it. "Let's talk about what we can build instead of what we fear," Jim urged, his voice cutting through the downpour. "Look, I know what it feels like to carry the weight of mistrust, but trust is built on something more substantial than tradition. It's built on shared purpose." Each word felt like a deliberate strike against the hardened beliefs encasing those around him. The ranchers clustered together like storm clouds, simmering with doubt, yet a flicker of engagement revealed itself in their shifting expressions. And then, almost as if the universe was conspiring to assist him, he recalled the parchment tucked neatly in his pocket. It bore not just a rough sketch of a plan, but also the seeds of a radical new dialogue, a proposal for joint efforts on resources and community investments. Admiring the brilliance of Eli's trust in him, he felt a surge of responsibility, not just as a father, but as a catalyst demanding change. "Eli and I have thought about creating something new, something where we can share our resources and collaborate. This ranch," he gestured broadly, could become a place not only of agriculture but of learning and mutual growth. The murmurs increased, the tension tangible. With the stakes ever higher, Jim continued, "We've all watched this world change around us, some for the better, some for the worse. But isn't it our duty to shape that future rather than let fear mold it for us?" For a fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of a softer side within Tom's gaze, the same vulnerability mirrored in his own heart, like two conflicting storms. Suddenly, the collective pressure felt less like a siege and more like a crossroads demanding resolution. "Can't any of us recall a time when we were united, when fear didn't govern us?" Linda's voice quivered, trembling between disbelief and hope. "Yes!" Jim interjected, riding the wave of her emotional connection. "But that cohesiveness requires courage. It demands a willingness to become vulnerable with one another. We aren't here as rivals. We're here for our future, our children. Let's convert our skepticism into strength." The crowd fell silent, the rain drumming rhythmically as they absorbed his words. The very air vibrated with the potential of that moment. Jim, raw and unyielding, an anchor against the storm raging outside. In this environment of doubt, he had managed to plant a seed of possibility. Then, just as the collective mood seemed on the cusp of shifting, a shadow flickered across the ranchers' faces. Carl, who had remained distant and scowling, stepped forward, an amalgam of anger and confusion. "And what if this collaboration doesn't work? What if you lead us off a cliff?" The challenge hung in the air, but Jim found himself ignited. He had wrestled with that question long before Carl spoke it. The risk of not trying is far greater than the risk of failure. We owe it to ourselves to at least consider it. Besides, what would we say to our children if we strive in our silence? Are we not at a precipice, with our decisions dictating the legacy we leave behind? Carl stared him down, the lines of fury etched deep in his face, but Jim could see the vulnerability glimpsing through the cracks. The raindrops lessened in their ferocity, the clouds above beginning to part. Yet as clarity seeped into the air, Jim realized the discussions that loomed ahead might not just challenge the ranchers, they would transform him in ways he couldn't begin to foresee. Despite the cracklings of potential unity, a foreboding realization pinched at him. Eli's faith in his father ignited burgeoning expectations, but so did the rancher's skepticism, blending fear and hope into a complicated weave. Would he harness this moment effectively and steer the critical narrative towards strength? Or would the doubts congeal once more, shrouding the warmth of possibility? The thunder rolled as he bore the weight of what lay ahead, the transformation of his future suspended in the balance, teetering on the edge of his next move. As the clouds began to shift and the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, Jim felt a pressure building within him, one that resembled the storm's tension but was decidedly more personal. The ranchers were no longer just figures in weathered hats and boots. They were souls intertwined with his own, their fears a mirror reflecting his own vulnerabilities. Gathering this newfound courage, he recognized that this was a chance not just to advocate future cooperation, but to confront his own limits. He stood before them, the weight of their gazes pressing down as life surged in stillness. "We're at a crossroads, untethered by fear but filled with the potential of our choices," he declared, his own voice trembling, betraying a hint of the fear he sought to dispel. As Carl's brow furrowed deeper, it felt as if he embodied every doubt Jim had ever harbored. In that moment, Jim confronted an uncomfortable truth. The ranchers were more than skeptical because of history. They were resisting change out of fear of the unknown, and so was he. Stretching his thoughts beyond the present, Jim envisioned this question. Did he truly believe in his own proposition? "Let's talk risk," Jim challenged, figuring that naming the elephant in the room might diffuse tension. "It isn't about whether we fall or succeed. It's about what happens if we stay stagnant. What kind of legacy will we leave our children? One of missed opportunities?" The vulnerability in his own heart began to resonate outward, his words vulnerable enough to pierce the stormy air. The rain continued to fall, but something had shifted amongst the ranchers. They seemed to be weighing their past burdens of skepticism against the faint beacon of Jim's proposed vision. Yet Carl still stood steadfast, a fortress of doubt challenging each of Jim's intentions. "Change is messy, Jim," Carl's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. "What makes you think you can navigate us through the chaos?" Here lay an opportunity. The storm brewing within him rose. Jim felt the edges of clarity sharpening his mind. "Because I'm not asking you to follow me blindly," he replied, grounding each word in his conviction. "I'm asking you to partner with me, to help shape this vision. Together we can mitigate the chaos. We can be the architects of a foundation, rather than be victims to the whim of tradition." Silence fell heavy as Carl digested Jim's challenge, a whirlpool of conflicting emotions swirling in the space between them. This could either strengthen their link or unravel the fragile thread woven with doubt, an affirmation of his own commitment to foster change. As he took a breath, Jim wondered if he could truly lead this new dialogue. Was he equipped not only to propose but to facilitate? He had experienced leadership before, but this felt raw. A terrain where every misstep could deepen the distrust festering in the hearts of those he hoped to unite. Doubt still walked heavily beside him, but an unexpected strength emerged from the uncertainty. Perhaps the antidote to fear was vulnerability, and there he found a sliver of purpose. He would expose his own apprehensions, and in doing so, invite the ranchers to do the same. "Let's lay our cards on the table, not just words or ideas. What are our fears? What if we could face them one by one? It won't happen overnight, but we begin with the first step toward trust. I'll go first." The tension broke, if only slightly. The flicker of hope reached Tom again, whose eyes now shone with interest, and Linda shifted, no longer on the defense but curious. As he prepared to share his fears, Jim's thoughts drifted to Eli, who looked to him with unwavering faith. Could he honor that trust in the shadow of uncertainty? With resolve steeling him against the weight of the moment, Jim took a deep breath, preparing to delve deeper into his psyche and the vulnerabilities he carried as a father and a leader. The stakes were escalating, and the next words could determine the course not just for the ranchers, but also for his own identity, wrestling against the demons of self-doubt. The clouds had parted, but the storm had only just begun. Would Jim discover the courage to face his own vulnerabilities, the secrets he had hidden even from himself, as the call of leadership surged within him? What awaited him as he peered into the abyss that defined his true character? As the last echoes of thunder rolled behind him, Jim could sense a profound shift echoing in the spaces between words. Each rancher's steadfast gaze reflected a mixture of skepticism and burgeoning curiosity. Their expressions were still painted in conflict, yet nestled deep within their apprehensions, Jim spotted sparks of something powerful, a readiness to confront fear. "Today I stand before you not just as a rancher, but as a father," he began, his voice steadying, feeling the calm within himself and the storm around him. "I've lived in the shadows of what others have believed to be right, often at the cost of my happiness and the future I hope to cultivate for Eli." The truth hung in the air, raw yet refining. He glanced at Eli, who stood beside him, eyes wide with encouragement. A rush of protective warmth coursed through Jim's veins. He realized that beyond defending the Apache mother and child, he was forging a path for his own son, teaching him that courage could manifest in standing up for neighborly bonds, even at great risk. "I fear losing this ranch," Jim continued, laying bare the vulnerability that once numbed him. "Yet, I fear being trapped in the silent complicit acceptance of prejudice far more. I cannot abide by a lifetime of shadows when there's a chance to foster a legacy brimming with light." He opened his palms, inviting them in rather than pushing them away. A couple of ranchers exchanged wary glances. A glimmer of understanding began to bud among them, though many still wrestled with doubt. "Change is hard, Jim," Tom finally spoke, softer than before, though the tension still lingered in his voice. "What you're asking for is not just courage, it's a complete shift in the way we think. We've been this way our entire lives." Jim nodded, fully aware of how entrenched sentiment could become, but that truth only deepened his resolve. "I get it," he replied, leaning into the shared history. "But maybe we're at a critical juncture, a point where progress is beckoning us to step beyond the borders of fear and toward uncharted territories of unity." The rain had settled into a soft drizzle, framing the backdrop of Jim's exhortation, an invitation to embrace vulnerability over division. "What if I told you this embrace doesn't have to mean abandoning who we are? Instead, wouldn't it show that we are evolving into better guardians for our children? When bigotry seeps through the cracks, it fractures our community's foundation. As fathers, It's our responsibility to ensure our children inherit stronger ties rather than bitter divides. His words began to resonate. A ripple of murmurs threaded through the ranchers. This was Jim's moment. He stood no longer merely as a family defender, but as a bridge builder wielding empathy as his shield. "Let me share a vision with you," he urged, drawing strength from their flickering interest. "One where our daughters and sons grow up not sheltered from outsiders, but enriched by the diversity of experiences, where they learn to appreciate the tapestry woven by different families. I envision a future where laughter flourishes untainted by prejudice." For the first time, Jim allowed the vision for his orchard of ideas to flourish. Together, we can create programs that celebrate our different heritages instead of fearing them. What if we open our doors and host gatherings where we teach our youth the values of kinship and acceptance? A moment passed, the silence transforming the atmosphere. A voice broke through, Linda, eyes glistening with an indiscernible emotion. What if you're right, Jim? What if we can create a community that's no longer bound by the fear of the unknown? We might cultivate a garden that gives more than it takes. Jim felt a shiver of encouragement swell within him, igniting hope. "Yes," he exclaimed, "let's plant our roots deeper together, intertwining in support rather than demanding allegiance. Let's show our children that belonging comes from nurturing, not exclusion." With renewed momentum, Jim laid his plan before them. Practical steps, community engagements, highlighting shared values over stark differences. He detailed how they could invite Sarah and Eli to be part of that journey, not just by welcoming them, but through actively engaging them in the ranch's revitalization. Yet fear still clung to Tom, and as doubts clouded his brow, Jim approached him softly. "Tom, it's okay to be afraid. Change will stir the pot of comfort, but together we can manage those storms." After a pause pierced with reflection, Tom's shoulders dropped slightly. "Maybe I've been stubborn," he expressed, each word laced with a restricted admission. "But can you promise me this won't affect our families negatively?" "I promise," Jim assured him, extending a hand through the tension. "It's time we redefine our legacy together to cultivate a brighter future. If we fail together. But if we succeed, it's built on the community we forge through acceptance and courage." As the final words echoed, he felt the heavy weight in the room beginning to shift. An air of tentative possibility emerged, one where the grip of fear softened for moments of shared vision. With the storm's fury now diminished to a calm, Jim began to notice subtle nods among the ranchers. There was a shift. The walls had begun to thin, but the journey ahead remained fraught with the potential for conflict, a reflection that this was only the beginning of their collective reformulation of values. For himself, Jim Callahan's transformation had crystallized in these pivotal minutes. Shadows of doubt were giving way to clarity, strength enveloping the vulnerability he had once feared. In standing for justice, connection, and compassion, he had not just acted as a protector. He had become an architect of a renewed relationship, one that sought to revive the bonds of family, community, and love. His resolve growing stronger still, Jim realized the true satisfaction lay not just in his mission, but in the legacy crafted through relationship building. A movement that began with a small act of kindness unfolding into a heartfelt shift. As they moved toward collective decisions, Jim reflected on the power of his journey. He had not only embraced his role as a father and protector, but had woven that role into the fabric of community life. And though uncertainty could linger just outside, he felt anchored, not just by the values he upheld, but by the relationships he fostered. Today marked the flowering of a commitment not just to Sarah and Eli, but to continuing forward, hand in hand, with those once seen as adversaries, toward a community reborn. Jim turned to Eli, warmth flooding through him. In this moment, he saw a father redefine his purpose. To nurture connection amid adversity, to be unyielding in pursuit of justice, and to live boldly in love. As the sky cleared, the potential ahead shimmered brighter, washing away veils of doubt, signaling the dawn of a new legacy, as ranchers stood united, rooted in understanding and collaboration. Now, seized by the urgency to share this culmination of growth, subscribe immediately to the channel to not miss the next exclusive emotional stories. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm, showing you support building new legacies. Comment your reactions and theories about what this transformation means for Jim, Sarah, and Eli. Share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion, because true fans of personal overcoming stories understand the power of connection. Don't wait even one more second to share.